Born into small-town anonymity, Carl Dean Switzer rocketed to a level of fame most children only dream of, forever recognized as Alfalfa from the iconic Our Gang comedies. But behind that unforgettable cowlick and the squeaky off-key singing lay a restless, sometimes reckless spirit who seemed destined for stormy waters. From a childhood in Paris, Illinois, to the glitz of Hollywood, to a final act that involved bullets, lawsuits, and unending controversy, Carl Switzer's story mixes nostalgia with tragedy. It's a roller coaster of early success, adult challenges, and a bitter end that left people wondering, was he a lovable kid star undone by circumstance, or a man who couldn't outrun his worst impulses? He came into this world on August 7th, 1927, the youngest of 4 children born to Gladys Carey Shanks and George Frederick Fred Switzer. This small family in Paris, Illinois, had already faced heartbreak. Their very first child passed away in 1922, barely an hour after birth. Carl's older sister Janice arrived in 1923, and his brother Harold in 1925. Though the family was modest, both Carl and Harold quickly showed an undeniable flair for music, entertaining neighbors with singing and a handful of instruments they could play surprisingly well. In a tight-knit community like theirs, that raw talent caught on. It seemed all roads for these 2 brothers led straight to some kind of spotlight. That spotlight came faster than anyone anticipated. In 1934, when Carl was only 6, the Switzers ventured out to California to visit extended family. During this trip, they decided to tour Hal Roach Studios, famous for producing comedic shorts. What was meant as a casual family outing turned into a surreal turning point. Carl and Harold, always ready to perform, strolled into the open-to-the-public cafeteria known as the Our Gang Cafe and launched into an impromptu musical act. It must have seemed like a small gesture, 2 wide-eyed kids fooling around. But the right person happened to be there, Hal Roach himself. Intrigued by the Switzer boys' confidence, comedic timing, and that intangible spark casting agents dream about, Roach made a decisive move. He signed both on the spot. Harold became known as Slim and Deadpan, while Carl inherited the nickname Alfalfa. The latter alias would define the rest of his life. Their first on-screen appearance came in the Our Gang short Beginner's Luck, released in 1935. Despite the official brand of Our Gang being built around existing stars, especially George Spanky McFarlane, it didn't take long for Carl's Alfalfa persona to dominate the comedic arcs. He was all toothy grin, hair sticking up in that iconic cowlick, and a hilariously off-pitch singing voice that turned everyday scenes into comedic gold. In reality, Carl was actually a decent singer, but Hal Roach Studio had a trick. They pitched the musical accompaniment slightly out of Carl's range, creating that squawky squeal whenever Alfalfa tried to hit the high notes. It became a signature gag that audiences immediately latched onto. And in no time, Alfalfa was arguably eclipsing even Spanky in popularity. That meteoric rise led to tension behind the scenes. While Carl and Spanky got along all right, their fathers were often at each other's throats, obsessively comparing screen time, paychecks, and the distribution of lines. Show business was new to families like the Switzers, and it brought a fresh set of problems for parents who'd never navigated Hollywood's competitive swirl. On top of that, childhood stardom often invites tricky dynamics within a cast. Interestingly, Carl's best friend on set turned out to be his supposed on-screen nemesis, Tommy Bond, Butch. They bonded over how no one wanted to replace them. They were, in an odd way, safer as a pair than alone, even if their characters were constantly clashing in front of the camera. By 1940, the Our Gang journey ended for Carl, who had just turned 12. The show was pivoting away from its original cast, and older kids like Alfalfa were naturally phased out. After spending almost half his life on set, Carl faced the daunting prospect of forging a career outside the cozy bubble of Hal Roach Studios. His first post-hour gang role was a minor part as a Boy Scout in I Love You Again with William Powell and Myrna Loy. Over the next few years, he jumped from small role to small role, Regular Fellers in 1941 and Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch in 1942. Then came fleeting appearances in Johnny Doughboy, 1942, The Human Comedy, 1943, and Going My Way, 1944, among others. Despite the shift, audiences hadn't forgotten Alfalfa. In 1946 and 1947, Carl starred in a short-lived imitation of the Bowery Boys franchise called Gas House Kids, reprising that comedic style of sour vocals and comedic mishaps. But the film studio behind it, PRC, was absorbed by Eagle Line, halting production. Around that time, Carl deliberately tried to downplay his Our Gang roots. In a 1946 resume, he referred to the famous comedic short simply as MGM Short Product, as though they were a minor footnote in his background. Possibly he wanted to be taken seriously as an actor, free from the child star label that can overshadow adult aspirations. Even so, no matter what roles he took, fans saw him as Alfalfa. He did land small but memorable spots in major films. He's glimpsed in the 1946 Christmas classic, It's a Wonderful Life, though if you blink, you might miss him, as he's simply Donna Reed's date at a high school dance. He popped up in On Our Merry Way, 1948, played a busboy in Pat and Mike, 1952, and in 1954's White Christmas, only his photograph appears, humorously labeled Freckle-Faced Haynes, the Dog-Faced Boy. Perhaps the best indicator of his emerging range came in the early 1950s when he turned to television. He popped into the Roy Rogers Show half a dozen times, tested out a new kind of performance in the anthology series Science Fiction Theater, and even visited the George Burns and Gracie Allen Show. Things looked hopeful. He was no longer the cherubic little boy in short pants. He was trying to stretch beyond comedic novelty. Around 1953 and 1954, he teamed up with director William A. Wellman on 3 films, Island in the Sky, The High and the Mighty, and Track of the Cat. That last film genuinely excited Carl, because for once he wasn't being asked to resurrect Alfalfa. He played a white-haired Native American adult, a real character part. This felt like a milestone. He'd been given the chance to act rather than just cameo as the comedic kid star. If audiences had grown up with him in Our Gang, maybe they'd welcome a more mature Carl Switzer. In parallel with his film and TV hustle, Carl was developing another passion: animals, particularly hunting dogs. Off camera, he became known for breeding and training these dogs and guiding hunts for an array of high-profile clients, including Roy Rogers, Dale Evans, James Stewart, and Henry Fonda. It was the kind of pursuit that might have kept him grounded, a way of connecting with nature instead of the Hollywood chaos. To everyone's surprise, that outdoorsy side to him thrived. For a while, it seemed like he might transition out of acting altogether and into the world of professional hunting guides, a big leap from the comedic sets of Roach Studios. But life had other plans. In early 1954, he was set up on a blind date with Diantha Collingwood, an heiress linked to Collingwood Grain. The two hit it off fast and hard, marrying 3 months later in Las Vegas. Perhaps it was the novelty of meeting someone outside the entertainment sphere, or Carl's youthful charm, that sparked their whirlwind romance. They ended up in Kansas, courtesy of Diantha's mother, who offered them a farm near Pretty Prairie. If you picture little Alfalfa in overalls, it's not too wild an image. He was from a small town after all. But working farmland day after day was no small endeavor. Soon, Diantha became pregnant with their son, Justin Lance. Whether Carl truly wanted to settle into a life of plowing fields and raising a family is debatable. Even his old friend George Spanky McFarland later recalled that Carl admitted he'd throw a radio on the tractor just to break the monotony, all the while itching for something more in line with his restless personality. His family life became strained. By 1957, the marriage fell apart. Diantha remarried, and her new husband adopted Lance. Carl returned to California, presumably to find more stable acting gigs or continue guiding hunts. Trouble kept finding him, though. In January 1958, a bizarre incident occurred. As he was getting into his car outside a Studio City bar, a bullet shattered the window and lodged itself in his upper arm. He was lucky it wasn't worse. Strangely, the perpetrator was never identified or caught. Later that year, he got busted for cutting down 15 pine trees in Sequoia National Forest, apparently planning to sell them as Christmas trees without a permit. He got a year's probation and a stiff fine. It seemed that for every small victory, there was a misadventure or close call overshadowing his progress. A few months later, a debt over a hunting dog spiraled into the defining tragedy of Carl's life. He'd been training a treeing Walker coonhound for a friend and former colleague, Moses Samuel Bud Stilts. While in Carl's care, the dog ran off after a bear and vanished. Stilts demanded that Carl either replace the dog or compensate him for the loss. Carl, by then short on cash, put up flyers, took out ads, and offered a reward for the dog's safe return. Eventually, someone did find the hound and brought it to Carl, who rewarded the rescuer with $35 in cash and $15 worth of free drinks at the bar he worked in. This made Carl furious, feeling he'd spent $50, a decent chunk of change in those days, on a dog that wasn't even his. He believed Stilts should pay him back that finder's fee, especially given the dog was indeed Bud's property. As tensions flared, Carl and a friend, 37-year-old photographer Jack Piott, decided to confront Stilts directly. The story has many conflicting versions, but the gist is that on January 21, 1959, the pair arrived at Stilts' home in Mission Hills to demand their money. Words escalated, furniture was struck, a glass-domed clock shattered against Stilts' head. Stilts retreated to a back room and came out wielding a .38 caliber revolver. At some point, the gun went off, nearly striking Tom Corrigan, Bud's 14-year-old stepson. The bullet lodged in the ceiling. Carl supposedly said something along the lines of, "Well, we shot Tommy, enough of this," and tried to leave, but a second shot rang out. This time the round tore into Carl's groin, severing an artery. He staggered, losing blood rapidly, and didn't make it to the hospital alive. He was declared dead at 7:27 p.m., aged just 31. Bud Stilts insisted he'd acted in self-defense, claiming Carl had threatened him with a knife and said, "I'm going to kill you." For decades, that remained the official version. Some newspapers reported that Carl had brandished a hunting knife. Investigators, though, discovered it was just a small penknife found under his body, closed. Tom Corrigan, the stepson, gave an account that contradicted Stilts' testimony, saying Carl was actually heading out the door when Bud pulled the trigger. Tom also claimed that the only reason Piott wasn't shot too was because sirens started blaring in the distance, scaring Stilts into backing down. Yet none of Corrigan's statements ever made it before a jury. He wasn't called to testify at the coroner's inquest. Stilts, who had a past perjury conviction, testified on his own behalf and walked away free. No charges were brought. For many, it felt like an uneven resolution to a conflict that ended a life. Carl died on the same day as the famous director-producer Cecil B. DeMille, So mainstream press coverage of Alfalfa's tragic final chapter was drowned out by DeMille's obituaries. The boy who had once starred in the comedic short Our Gang Follies of 1938 and had bit parts in classics like It's a Wonderful Life would now rest in relative obscurity. He was interred at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery on January 27, 1959, his gravestone adorned with Masonic symbols and the image of a hunting dog, testament to that wilderness passion he nurtured. Some fans who visited the grave recognized the irony. He'd acted in the Ten Commandments, uncredited as a Hebrew slave, one of DeMille's last big productions, and now he shared the day of passing with the film legend. Those who knew Carl best had mixed feelings. Spanky McFarlane remembered him as kind of cocky, a little antsy, with big talk, but a heart that struggled to find a real home outside the showbiz bubble. In many ways, the comedic persona of Alfalfa overshadowed everything else Carl tried to do. He was never just Carl Switzer, he was always Alfalfa, the whiny-voiced cut-up with the tuft of hair defying gravity. Even after he left our gang, even when he was training dogs, even when he was trying to farm or cameoing in serious films, that shadow followed him. Could he have lived a more peaceful life if he'd never trotted into Hal Roach Studios as a 6-year-old? Maybe, but show business held a strong allure, complete with big checks, fan mail, and the thrill of performing. Over the years, new details have emerged, fueling speculation. Tom Corrigan once went on record decades after the shooting, insisting it was essentially murder, that Carl was no threat when Bud pulled the trigger. Others maintained that Carl was intoxicated, furious, and volatile, and if not for that second shot, maybe Bud would have been the victim. The official file stands on self-defense, and with Bud passing away in 1983, it's likely we'll never have a definitive consensus on what truly happened. The swirl of what-ifs will remain. Tommy Bond once said he and Carl were good friends because neither of us could replace the other, hinting that maybe a sense of unshakable camaraderie came from those raucous days on set. While the Our Gang brand projected images of playful camaraderie, the real interactions behind the camera could be fraught with adult demands, contract squabbles, and the ever-shifting loyalties of child performers. Even so, children often find ways to form alliances. Carl's relationship with Tommy Bond is one of those bright spots in his story. Two kids who hammered out pretend conflicts in front of rolling cameras, but found mutual respect offset. For fans, Carl Switzer's life merges a sense of nostalgia with heartbreak. Every time you see an old Our Gang short on TV, you might think, here's that lovable Alfalfa, not realizing that behind the jokes was a child star with a complicated future. The comedic timing, the real boyish charm that made him so endearing, would eventually intersect with the harsh realities of an adult world. How can any childhood star, especially in the 1930s and 40s, when child labor regulations were in their infancy and studios held immense power, handle that transition into adulthood, especially if fame starts to dwindle? The question remains relevant today, but in Carl's era, it was a free-for-all. If the studio wanted more squeaky singing, you did it. If you tried to break out of that mold, the opportunities were slim to none. What we do know is that Carl's short life encapsulated a bittersweet arc. He burst onto the scene an adorable cherub with comedic gold in his voice cracks and bungled lines. America fell in love with Alfalfa, but Alfalfa never found solid ground in adulthood. He searched in multiple places: marriage to an heiress, fatherhood, side gigs as a bartender and dog trainer, bit parts in big movies, cameo roles that teased a second wind for his career. None of it stuck. Some child stars manage the transition. Some fade away gracefully. Some reinvent themselves. Carl's attempt seemed full of friction, overshadowed by the sense that he was always 2 steps away from trouble. The near-fatal bullet that whizzed through his car window in 1958 was a prelude to the shot that would claim his life a year later. Hollywood, ironically, moved on swiftly. Viewers of syndicated Our Gang shorts kept right on laughing at Alfalfa's comedic attempts to woo Darla Hood, never knowing or perhaps never caring about the real-life fate that befell the boy behind the iconic character. Perhaps the greatest reminder is that behind each beloved on-screen character stands a real person, shaped by constraints and choices we often never see. Carl Switzer lived fast, died young, and left the world uncertain about just how to remember him. Was he a comedic gem undone by bad luck, or a hot-headed dreamer who never truly outgrew the illusions of youth? Maybe both, maybe more. And that complexity, more than the comedic hair flip or the quavering baritone, may be Carl Switzer's lasting legacy.